Good morning, everyone, on this beautiful, beautiful Wednesday morning, May Day, Workers' Day. I once walked around Boekap on a Sunday morning. I was looking for kusistas, and I went into Rose Corner Cafe, and it was very much a day like this, misty and moody. And the shopkeeper, the old man who used to own Rose Corner Cafe, and he said, "Very lovely day we're having, aren't we?" And so I thought, yes, that is a very lovely day. I think that's how you know you're a Cape Townian, when you could be covered and clouded in mist and say, what a lovely day it is. But thank you so much, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Jonathan for inviting me to talk to him today about his book, Bullshit, 50 Fibs That Made South Africa. My name is Lester Kiewit, and firstly, let me first tell publicly that I never worked directly under you during independent newspaper days, or now where you work at News 24, but I've been greatly inspired by the rigor of your work, but also the humor of your work and simply the beauty of your writing, Jonathan. So I am very, very much a fan of my esteemed, now a little bit senior colleague. But thank you so much. Today we're talking about lies and fibs. And as South Africans, we love a fib. We fall for the tall tales. We're suckers for scams. Because I think very much of our story is based on lies and the inaccuracies and the myths that we tell each other and that we tell our collective story as South Africans. But let me tell you and open up with a story myself. Imagine the scene. It is 1999, and I am in grade 9, standard 7, and it's a parent-teacher meeting where you get dragged along, and your parents sit in the benches, and you have to sit just behind them, and the teacher has to say how absolutely amazing or absolutely terrible you are. And I will never forget Mrs. Slubber, my standard 7 accounting teacher, offering me the best compliment that I have ever been paid. It set the course, it lit the fuse, which boosted the rocket for my other professional endeavors. She said, "Mr. and Mrs. Kiewit, what we have here is a bullshitter." And little did Miss Slubber know that inspired, that lit something, that watered the seed, that just germinated, which made me throughout my life said, you don't necessarily need to know what you're doing. You just have to appear to know what you're doing. Find the pattern, and as they say, discover the algorithm, and we'll set you up. But we're talking about lies and bullshit, 50 fibs that make South Africa. Quick introduction of Jonathan Ancer. Of course, he is a veteran journalist, but also a veteran when it comes to writing books. 6 books now being penned by him, various opinion pieces, and also your work that you have done in the past of particularly mentoring younger journalists. I have read that work. But let's start with the first lie. Do writers of books in South Africa, they make a lot of money, don't they?
Absolutely. I arrived here in my Porsche. But thank you so much, Lester, and thank you for a very kind introduction. And I'm very, very flattered, but also a very big fan of your work and your puns and your just, it's not bullshit at all.
Thank you. Can I trust? We'll see. But let's start with the genesis of a book about lies and bullshit. Of course, I think we're very much predisposed in South Africa, which we'll get to in the course of our discussion, a propensity of bullshit, bullshitting, and bullshitters. But the genesis of a book about the lies that we tell.
So what had happened is Jeremy Borain, who is at Jonathan Ball, the publisher, invited me for coffee. And it's always dangerous when a publisher invites you for coffee. But we had coffee, and he told me he had this idea of a book looking at the history of South Africa through the lies that we've been told. And I was quite intrigued by this because, I grew up during apartheid. I went to apartheid schools, and I was told apartheid stories. And I just decided that this was an interesting perspective to look at South Africa's history. And I went away and I started doing some research, and it wasn't speaking to me. I thought, must I come from it from a historian's perspective? Must this be peer-reviewed? I was panicking. And then I got an email from Jeremy to say, we've had a little meeting and we've decided on the cover of the book and also the title. And then he sent me this very bold cover and this bold title. And then I thought, this I can do. And it let me sort of allowed me to be a little bit kind of humorous, although there are serious chapters, but it allowed me to tackle it from a journalist's perspective.
And because it's a very fun book, there are 50 stories, 50 vignettes, and within these chapters, sub-little branches of these stories. So I would say more than 50 lies, but 50 chapters of fibs and storytelling. But it is fun. Our history is serious, but it's these individual stories of individuals and maybe small collectives that is the collective range from the sublime to the absurdities, the very tactical and political to the absolutely bonkers crazy. That is the story of South Africans individually, that if we zoom out, this is essentially our story.
I think so. I agree. I think there are some little lies that maybe not even people, we can debate whether they are lies, but then there are fundamental, profound lies. And some that touch everybody, and some that just touched me, and some that kind of shaped South Africa and perhaps kind of sent us in a very different direction. I'm thinking about the very first lie about the fact that South Africa was uninhabited when colonialists arrived. I mean, that really shaped the course of apartheid.
Are you personally drawn to liars and scammers? You've written 2 books on apartheid spies. Do you have a particular interest in those that deceive?
Absolutely, and I've never thought of it like that. But yes, I think I'm very interested in how people decide to betray other people and what it takes for them to betray those people. I mean, the first book on Craig Williamson really opened my eyes into kind of evil. I saw somebody through this, digging away at the layers, who was utterly evil. And then the second book was a range of apartheid era spies, because some of them didn't spy for the apartheid government, some of them spied on the apartheid government. But it gave me quite a good understanding of the choices that people make. And I'm always quite fascinated with choices that we make. Why do some people make good choices and some people make terrible choices?
But what's your process? Just before we went live, we were talking about sometimes in our current state of our newsroom, you need I'm not saying an old person, an older person.
Old is okay.
Who has an institutional knowledge of newsrooms, but also about contemporary South African history. You need someone who says to a younger journalist, well, what you're talking about is not actually quite novel. In 1998, if I can remember, there was someone who did something similar. So to you, is it muscle memory from your years as being a journalist, or are there stories that actually I didn't know about?
There were definitely stories that I didn't know about, and stories that I should have known but didn't. But I think there was a sense of going back, and that's how it started really, is that I went back to my own sort of learning at school and trying to debunk some of those myths. And then, looking at the scams and the somebody like this Andries Nieuwoud, who, if people would remember, had this whole fraught milk pyramid scheme in the 1970s or 80s. And that was something that I'd completely forgotten about. And I think a lot of these stories we have forgotten about. Things happen so quickly and there's so much that we forget. I mean, even the Hansi Cronje story, I'd forgotten a lot of those details, even though the story I knew about, but the details of what happened. And that was kind of I felt like a personal betrayal, but the pyramid scheme, I think, was kind of one of the most, in world history of scams, it's like in the top 10.
Look, I think we can't be too hard on ourselves, but I think we hachebak when it comes to the South African news cycle. What was the front page of the City Press last week? Not this past Sunday, last week.
I can't remember.
Can't remember. Okay, I know this one was about forged signatures and the MK party, but I don't know what the front pages of the papers were. And I think we can't be too hard on ourselves when, what's the saying, South Africa is a movie, a series. You never know what's going to happen next. But I want to quote a book called The Lie of 1652 by Patrick Tarek Mele, who writes in his book, and I'll have a few passages here. Across all communities, the South African view of early Cape history tends to be molded by the interpretation of the 1652 Dutch landing at Table Bay as portrayed by the artist Charles Bell, who imagined the meeting between Rand van Riebeeck and the primitive Khoi people. The painting was painted 200 years after the fact, and in reality, there had already been 180 years of engagement before 1652. He also writes, when the Dutch came to the Cape, they were infatuated with two kingdoms based on hearsay in Europe, the Batua and the Monomotapu, because they were said to be the source of gold and ivory, essentially on what we now call the state of the Republic of South Africa, having been sprung up from where we are sitting now. Are we essentially a nation built on the premise of a lie?
I think we are, and I think that is our legacy. What astounds me is that the lie persists. No matter how much it's been debunked, it continues to be told and retold. And I think that was one of the messages that I wanted from this book is to engage with that. Why do we keep telling lies when the science and the history and the archaeologists and the have absolutely debunked that? Why does it still persist?
I will get to some of the chapters, and I encourage you, the books are available in the back corners. I encourage you to go pick it up, so we won't give all of the 50 fibs. We'll just give a few, and we'll tease. But before I get into that, what is your definition of a lie? Is it something that is factually untrue? Is it maybe not 100% honesty? But if you look at it from a certain angle and you close your eyes and you squint a little bit, maybe it actually could be true. What's your definition of a lie?
So I think it's very, very broad. There are different scales of lies. There's kind of little fibs and white lies and innocent lies that we tell, and then there are kind of really big, gigantic whoppers. And I think, it also can be very, very subjective. My definition, really, and also, of course, there are myths that are lies, there's euphemisms that are lies. So it's a very, very broad definition, which basically says kind of everything is a lie. We all lie, and we all lie all of the time.
Yeah, because I guess it's also, it goes with the nation's identity, the notion of what is our national myth. The Washingtonian example is George Washington admitted to chopping down the cherry tree because I cannot tell a lie. Is a lie. You have St. Patrick, who drove out all the snakes in Ireland. That is Ireland's national myth. In Germany, it's the Wagnerian operas. In Britain, it's the stories of King Arthur that brings about British nationalism. So all in all, we tell ourselves this myth. Is South Africa's myth colonialization, apartheid, the miracle of 1994? Is it all that, or everything rolled into one?
I think it's everything rolled into one, but I think you put it very neatly. I think it was also currently it's the Rainbow Nation myth. But just, because it's 30 years of democracy that we're just celebrating, and the first chapter really looks at that 1994 election. But I saw something that you referenced, and I thought I should have had that in the book, and it was the fact that was it the very first person who voted in the 1994 election?
Because of the quirks of time zones, South Africans in New Zealand were the very, very first people, South Africans, to vote.
Yes.
And black South Africans in New Zealand would have been the first black people to vote in that election, would have been on the 25th or the 26th of April.
And so I think there was a headline in a newspaper, Mandela's granddaughter, first black person to vote in South Africa.
His niece.
His niece. And it turned out to be a lie. She wasn't even South African. It had no relation to Mandela. And that was the start of our democracy. It was built on this myth. But what I was interested in that election was how perfect the results seemed to be. It seemed to be, in the run-up to election, we were on the brink of a civil war. The IFP and the ANC, there was, if you can remember all the bloodshed that was happening in those early 1990s, and the IFP didn't want to be part of the election, and then suddenly we have this election. They get kind of convinced to come into the election, and then we have this election, and the ANC gets 62% of the vote, which is a big enough margin for them to say that they've had a landslide victory, but it's not enough for them to unilaterally change the constitution. The National Party get a significant slice, I think it's 20%. They win the Western Cape, and F.W. de Klerk becomes the deputy president. And the IFP also gets a significant percentage. They win KwaZulu-Natal, and Buthelezi becomes a minister in the cabinet. It was just too good to be true. And so I went and looked at was our democracy, was the result, was it a lie? And I spoke to Professor Stephen Friedman, who was working in the IEC, and he said, well, it's not really a lie, it's a fabricated truth. And I think that kind of sums it up.
But yeah, that pie was too neatly carved up. But if a lie serves a common good, is it wrong?
Well, Stephen Friedman's perspective or view was that he had been asked to write a paper about what would be a free and fair election, and he said, if the losers accept the results, then it's a fair election. It doesn't matter what that result is. If the losers accept it, it's okay. It's not a lie. And everybody accepted it. People who had lodged complaints withdrew all their complaints, which was what he called circumstantial evidence. But he said that this result prevented more blood being shed, and he could live with it. So I think maybe sometimes we need to tell lies for the greater good. I don't know.
Okay, we can open up the conversation, and I'm hearing some moans already. But let's look at the South African equivalent of the Washingtonian example, and that is Nelson Mandela, the founding father of our nation. You dedicate several chapters to him, and you dispel certain notions, but I want to put to you three sentences, three statements, and maybe just if you could preface what your chapters say about it. So the one statement is Nelson Mandela was a terrorist.
Okay, so that was the first statement that the National Party told about Mandela, that he was involved in all these terrible sabotage acts, and he painted this picture. They painted this picture of Mandela being a terrorist, and I go and I explain, why I don't believe he was a terrorist.
Nelson Mandela was a saint.
Yeah. So I also go and I debunk that to say actually to remember him as a saint isn't actually fair to his own legacy. And he often would say, I'm not a saint unless you think a saint is a sinner who stops trying. I hope I've quoted him correctly. But to remember him as a saint isn't fair to our legacy, us, and also not fair to him. He was a human being who had flaws, political flaws, personal flaws, but he was a human being, a flesh and blood person, and that's what we must remember him as.
And then the third statement, which has become a little bit more trendier to say from younger people, but now also we're hearing in parties participating in this elections, many of them who were comrades and part of the negotiating table with Nelson Mandela, who say Nelson Mandela was a sellout.
And again, I don't believe that is true either. I think there's a lot of anger at the way that the negotiations took place. Now, 30 years later, people are saying Mandela probably kind of offered the carrot instead of the stick, and there's anger about that. But I think that also isn't true, and it doesn't offer us a sort of a nuanced look at who he was and what he achieved. I mean, he negotiated in a very difficult climate, and by all, he negotiated very well. It was a difficult time. There was the Boipatong massacre. He stood up and he said, I'm not going to carry on negotiating when you've got blood on your hands. And he pulled out of those talks, those initial Codesa talks. But he was very pragmatic and he was very realistic. And I think he didn't buckle to the National Party at all. I think he stood firm. And I think we have to remember those nuances. History is messy. History is complicated. When we talk about these myths and these national identities, it's very easy to say, the rainbow nation, but actually our history is multifaceted and layered, and to really understand it, we have to accept that it's not neat.
But Jonathan, Nelson Mandela died in prison in 1986. The man who was released and negotiated with F.W. de Klerk wasn't. Everyone knows it wasn't Nelson Mandela.
This was one of those things that I hadn't known about until I started doing some research and discovered that there's this whole conspiracy that Mandela never came out of prison. He died in prison. And it's a widespread conspiracy. It's not just a few people behind a keyboard. There's kind of a lot of people who believe this, that he died. And the proof is that we have to do 67 minutes on the real Mandela's birthday, because he died when he was 67 years old, actually really died. And of course, the person who came out of prison was a plant by either America or Britain, depending on which conspiracy you choose to believe. And it was a puppet of the National Party. And so when the National Party were negotiating with the ANC, they were actually negotiating with themselves. So
I've gone down social media wormholes of people trying to explain. And one example of, you see, that's not Nelson Mandela is because there was a picture with the real Nelson Mandela standing next to a wax model of Nelson Mandela, and people trying to explain, you see, the man there is not Nelson, but Nelson Mandela is also, you can clearly see it's a wax model. But you mentioned of quotes and quotable quotes, and you end off the book by quoting or misquoting Mark Twain, and the famous quote is, a lie goes around twice around the world before the truth gets out of bed and puts his shoes on. I may have misquoted that myself. But also, even Nelson Mandela's quotes, I have also, if I hear someone, Nelson Mandela said, and I have books of Nelson Mandela quotes, and I often can't find these quotable quotes that are often attributed to famous, notable people around the world, but particularly Nelson Mandela.
Yes, so I think we have to be careful about what we see, and there are lots of quotes, and I think anybody who has a political persuasion and wants to sort of prove their point often reaches for a very convenient quote, and you can find quotes. So what had happened with that Mark Twain quote is that I used to tell the students that I used to teach, try and emphasize the point of how important it is to be as credible as possible and to tell the truth and to seek the truth, that the lie goes twice around the world before the truth has time to put its pants on. And then when I wanted to find out the exact quote, I found that I had been misquoting Mark Twain, but actually it wasn't even Mark Twain who had said that. and so I think that just really proved my point to myself about how careful you have to be when you're quoting people.
Last week I interviewed a spokesperson for the MK party, and I asked him about the reports on apparently Jacob Zuma is ill, he's off the campaign trail, he had fallen, and the person insisted. Now, Jacob Zuma is as healthy as he has ever been. But then I remember, wasn't this the same Jacob Zuma who argued that he was terminally ill, and so he couldn't finish a prison sentence? And we live in a terminal illness state. We have the walking dead amongst us, unfit to continue prison sentence, on death's door, but somehow not too unwell to take in a round of golf at the Durban Golf Club, but also seen puffing on a cigar. It's absolutely outrageous that we're told these yarns, but it's quite clear you're very healthy, Mr. Sheikh.
Yeah, that was quite fun writing that particular chapter. And yes, he continues to defy all odds. And quite remarkable, quite remarkable.
Lying should have consequences, particularly grave lies should have consequences. And when we get a little bit more serious in terms of how the lies and the fibs that we've been told, I particularly want to refer to your chapter on the 300,000 lives that unnecessarily perished because of a lie. And not just a lie, the stubbornness to maintain a lie. And this was during the presidency of Thabo Mbeki and his AIDS denialism. Lies aren't just nice stories to tell. Years later, they have consequences, and the families of 300,000 people still live with those repercussions today.
Yeah. There were a couple of chapters that made me angry, so that also isn't a fun chapter, but writing about Mbeki's stubbornness to acknowledge AIDS and HIV causing AIDS, and to really to not believe the science, not to follow the science. And that had absolutely devastating consequences, which I think we still feel today. But it also took me back to, that Virodine scandal. I mean, I'd also, in the back of my memory, it was sitting there, but the details were just astonishing. Here was this woman who claimed that she could bring rats back to life. And she was, the government just threw money at her, and this was going to be the answer. We were going to kind of find the cure for AIDS. But the consequences are, and that was a very dark, bleak time in our post-apartheid era. Our democracy was, lived through quite a tragic time.
Over the last few years, I guess since the emergence of Trumpian politics and QAnon got a very big dose of it during a COVID-19 pandemic, is that myths and lies that grow out of conspiracy theories. And if you can say that myths are lies that have grown legs, conspiracies are these wiry tentacles, that is a measure of distraction. I also think there's a measure of pessimism that's built into conspiracies, but also maybe a little bit of ordinary people like you and I simply trying to make sense of a very, very complicated and complex world. Maybe you want to expand on why conspiracy has entrenched conspiracy, misinformation, disinformation, fake news has entrenched itself into our current discussion.
Yeah, I think it's partly because of how information is spread, that and how you spoke about the algorithms and how it if we want to believe something, we can find the evidence to believe that, and then we sit behind our computers or behind the screens, and this information is just directed towards us until we really believe it. And before in those old days when you had newspapers and big newsrooms, there were fact checkers and there were balancers, people checking what was being written, and newspapers lost credibility if it turned out to be a lie. Now there aren't really consequences for publications themselves, but there aren't consequences because everybody behind a keyboard or behind a cell phone can disseminate information, and it's so easy for that information, misinformation, disinformation, just to spread. Absolutely. And I think we are looking for easy answers. We are looking, so if something kind of tells us, oh, well, this vaccine that we're going to get is actually Bill Gates' 5G is trying to control us. Actually, I'm feeling dissatisfied with what's happening, and I'm going to, there's some kind of credibility in that.
For some reason, my Wi-Fi connectivity has gotten better ever since I got the vaccine. I don't know why. But conspiracy is also there to control. I was born in the early 80s. I grew up in the 90s. So there was a period where I heard about the satanic panic.
Yeah.
And were things happening around. But the satanic panic, you're right, is also finds its roots in governmental control. The Rooi gevaar, drawn out of die Swart gevaar. If you play records backwards, there's a satanic message, and that is actually was a device of actually political control. There are reds under the beds.
Well, that was kind of a strong chapter for me because I went through that. I was in the mid-'80s. I was at high school in Johannesburg, a government high school, and we were sent off to Veld School with all the worms, telling us about the Rooi gevaar and the Swart gevaar, and then warning us not to listen to the Beatles because the Beatles have these terrible messages if you play them backwards, and they said, they're Satanists. And there was that sense of, the terrorists on the border. We had to stand guard duty, and they warned us that terrorists would come, and we had to, I think I had a comb in my pocket and a packet of raisins that my mother had sent me for Veld School. I'm not sure I was going to defend myself from the terrorists with a packet of raisins. Maybe they would be allergic to raisins, I don't know. But this was all part of the propaganda, and it was very, very effective. And we saw how effective it was when we tried to dismantle this system.
Because up until quite long into our democracy, I think we were the only, if not a few countries who actually still had an occult unit within the South African police services and detectives who were meant to investigate occult matters and Satanism. When now, and I remember this from a couple of years ago, I did a story about, it speaks to the freedoms of association in South Africa. We have a South African Satanic Church registered with the Department of Social Development as an NPO, and in fact interviewed, and I was invited to the home in Philadelphia on the N7 to the high priest of the Satanic Church, and this is a Lutheran raised boy. And I'll reserve my judgment. You can maybe ask me later whether I found the experience, but it just speaks to the path that we've come, that what was taboo, illegal, if not sacrilegious in the 1970s, 80s is now open in a free and democratic society.
Absolutely. I mean, I just think of the Immorality Act. I mean, that was a lie, that it's immoral for white and black people not to sort of have relationships. That itself is a lie. Separate development. There's no such thing as development when there was no development. Bantu education. Where was the education? All of those sort of lies that were told just in our language. We've come a long way.
I just want to remind Luke, I want to engage and let the audience engage, but I do not have a watch on me, so I have plenty of notes. So I'm going to have, is it 15 minutes left? Okay, so you will, so I can engage with the audience, because I still have so much to cover in the notes that I've made. It was absolutely fascinating, but I want to get a little bit personal with you, Jonathan. What lie are you most disappointed by? Something that touches you personally, that made you feel the same way as someone or your parents telling you that the tooth fairy is not real? Mine was Hansie
I
Cronje.
was about to say, yeah, that really sort of, there was a sense of betrayal. I really felt it. When the allegations emerged that, Hansie, I think they first emerged that there was one of the South African cricketers had been involved in match fixing. And I thought, that's not true. And then it was, it's Hansie. And then I thought, oh my goodness. Then now I definitely know it's not true, because it could have been, if they'd said even John T. Rhodes, I thought that's, but not Hansie. Nobody, he was Captain Invincible. And I think growing up and seeing what had become of this cricket team that was just like this, the little team that could, and how they had been on, they looked like they gelled, and they looked like they were loving cricket, and they were competing, and suddenly everything that you thought you knew turned out to be a sham. And
yeah, because like Francois Pienaar, Hansie Cronje, as the captain of the men's senior cricket team, also was called in and had a meeting with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela gave him his special mission that we understand that sport can unite South Africa. So there was a lot weighing on, and maybe that's because the sport is political in South Africa. They play a very, very important role, that we maybe invest a little bit more in sports people than we do in politicians, who actually we should be holding to more account.
Maybe we expect politicians to tell us lies, and maybe we expect more of our sports people. But yes, it felt like, I think the mood at the time was that here was something positive. And I think also his reason for cheating was just kind of greed, and I think that really...
Look, at least you can't blame Herschel Gibbs, who literally forgot to throw his wicket away. But let's talk a little bit of atonement. And is there anyone that you can think of that has atoned, maybe has redeemed themselves? Maybe not fully. The emotions of that commission was for all to see. Maybe it was the tragic nature of his death. Apparently, after living in obscurity, he worked for a photocopy company, or it was one of these big Nashua type company as a rep or somewhere. So I don't know, is there anyone that has, that you can think of that has atoned for telling lies and bullshitting?
Well, I know, sort of, I didn't write about him, but Adrian Vlok went around, and he seemed to have a kind of a genuine attempt to open up. But not really many of the apartheid era kind of assassins have shown any remorse.
Let's go to KZN, and I've had the pleasure of being at our national monument of corruption. I've been to Nkandla. And I was also in the press conference where the former Safety and Security Minister, Nathan Ancer, sweat enough to fill that fire pool. And because I had been in that press conference where they played bloody O Sole Mio over a video of this pool that was supposed to be a water retention device that was going to fight fires. And when I went to Nkandla, and I'm sorry, and my father's best friend is, so I'm sorry, uncle, kakprat. When I've never seen a more beautifully tiled water retention pond there. And when I heard Nathan Ancer and O Sole Mio, and I saw this pool, I thought, what the hell? How could you have spun this and told this blatant lie?
And the amazing thing is that he continues to believe it, even when Fikile and Balula that was astonishing. That really was sort of shamefaced, bald-faced, and just absolutely somebody sticking to his lie and just going for it.
Committed to the bit.
Committed, yeah.
Is what they call it.
You have to respect that.
Look, there's plenty of tragedy, and I'll use the example of well-publicized lies that particularly in what our media and news cycles have become, and not just the last few years, but I'd say after the last 20 years. And I think of the story of Happy Sindani, and the boy who pitched up at the police station. He claimed to have been born to white parents, but was abducted. It was later found it was half true. He was the product of an affair between a white man and a black domestic worker. And it's like these type of lies that grip our headlines. And for weeks, it's just like the sensationalism around the Taubu Bester story. Just talk to me about how lies and sensation and myths are now viewed through the prism of not only a mass media of TV, radio, print, but also social media.
Yeah. I mean, that Taubu Bester story was unbelievable. But, and it seemed to play out in real time. Well, it did play out in real time. We were getting we were being fed information. It was like a sort of a soap opera that we were seeing. But what astounded me about that story was that the police knew about it, and they hadn't done anything about it. They'd let a rapist and a murderer out. Well, they hadn't gone to investigate, and it was only because of a little newspaper or a little news publication, that started asking difficult questions that got the police to actually get their act together. But that really was a sensational story. And I think it tells the lie. It tells so many lies. It tells the lie that our police system is effective. It tells the lie. The person. Three bodies were kind of from the mortuary. Were just somebody just came and claimed 3 bodies. There were just so many extraordinary lies. This bloke from prison ran a business. People saying happy birthday to him. It was just astonishing. And I think that incident or that episode exposed so much of what is wrong with these levels of our
And it was this intersection of so many issues. It's the conversation of private prisons in South Africa, police and correctional services corruption. It brought into perspective celebrity culture in South Africa. We have a conference, talk shop, industrial conference where speakers are paid a tremendous amount of money. And we saw it now with Ray Joseph's reporting on the National Lotteries one, where there was someone who was paid 300,000 rand, no, 100,000 rand, to speak at a National Lottery's ethics summit, but he's some sort of celebrity. So the story of Thabo Bester just covered so many angles, and I think there was sensational, but it was a very important conversation. I'm going to be opening up to the audience. I'm sure you have a number of questions. I just want to talk, before I get to the audience, I want to talk to a question about lying and identity. And I'm a very big reader of Cape Town history and identity. But there is this idea of Cape Malay identity, which I have now read more and more. That is largely fiction. It's a creation of Idia Du Plessis, who was a commissioner of coloured affairs, and who essentially constructed a Cape Malay identity. And he had this Afrikaner nationalist who is in fact the founder of the Cape Malay Choir board. Not to say there is not weight in people having an affinity to each other, but it still seems that many of us in South Africa are attached to each other because of a story that didn't actually exist. Thoughts?
I think our national identity is complicated, and I think we have to sort of, recognize that we have come from a very difficult past, and we must accept that there aren't any easy answers, that it's messy, and what I'd encourage people to do is to kind of find out as much as possible about our own history and your own history, and where you come from, and where you're going, and see whether you can find your own truth.
Mr. Valley, at the back. We'll start there, and then the gentleman in the blue.
I thought, how can we got two media specialists? How do you disentangle the intersection between lies, prejudices, and power? And I thought it'd be good if the two of you just give us a couple of things around what we're seeing on our TV, what's happening in the Middle East, because that's a good example where lies, prejudices, and power intersect, where it'd be good to hear two media specialists commenting in that in an anecdotal way, in a sense. Thanks.
Jonathan, I'll have you go first.
I'm actually not even sure where to start. I think it really is kind of seeing what's happening is just so devastating. The looking at the media's role is just, I mean, if we talk about lies, there's just so many lies. Where do we unpack all of those lies? Where do we even start? I find it such a tragic kind of, what's happening, just so absolutely tragic. I think it really depends on how you choose to get your information, and where you choose to get it from, and who you choose to listen to. But I think there are no easy answers to that. Maybe there aren't even answers. What I think is quite powerful is that we're seeing stories that are being told by individuals, and I think we might not have been seeing that if social media hadn't opened up. But I think I'm not sure how.
I'll take it from the point of the lie that I was told in my first day of journalism school at Pentec is the notion of objectivity. And I soon realized, and the myth of objectivity is largely debunked, because we are all products of our prejudices and our biases, our lived experiences that make up our identity, but also our thought patterns. I generally have the freedom on my platform, it's on Talk Radio, where my contract says I may be a trained journalist, but my job that I fulfill there is a commentator. And I am given the freedom to commentate and to provide my point of view, and that lubricates the discussion, the important discussion that we must have. I largely appreciate the tactic of Mehdi Hassan, who is now a freelance journalist, and his view on particularly the Gaza, Palestine, and Israel is pretty clear. But what he does, he is an equal offender when he tries to hold both arguments to account. Doesn't mean that he steers away from his own personal prejudices, which he does and is able to in an editorialized fashion. When we have difficult conversations on air, I would, and often people with troubled notions or backgrounds or opinions want right of reply. My answer to them is, I have to be fair to you, I have to be balanced to you, but that does not mean I need to give you equal airtime as someone whose opinion, who I largely believe is to be the factual opinion. That is how I, largely whether it be issues around global geopolitics or whether it's issues around our personal electoral politics at the moment. I have to be fair, I have to be balanced. It does not necessarily mean I have to give you equal representation, particularly if I can use my judgment if you're not being a good faith actor in this particular conversation. Sir, sorry, in the blue.
Esther, thank you. I can see you well prepared. Well done. Jonathan, really enjoyed this. Underneath any lie or fib or story, there's truth. Do we find truth through finding out that lies are lies? Or how do I find truth, which is for me more important than I mean, this is really fun, but what is truth? How do we find it?
Well, I know that this is sold as a book about lies, but I think it's actually a book about truth, in the sense that it's telling the lies and trying to expose them. But I think you're right. There is truth behind every lie, and I think that's what the book is trying to do. And I think to find the truth, there needs to be a commitment to being, humble, to open yourself up to being wrong, and to accept that that your view is not correct. To be prepared to listen to other views and to be open-minded. And I think once we can start accepting that we might not always be right, or we might not be right about something, we can start getting closer to that truth.
That is great. There's no ego.
Yeah. But I think we have to be prepared to kind of do hard work and be introspective, and also commit ourselves not to be spreading misinformation. I think we can all play a role in sort of in education, educating ourselves, but also committing not to be part of the problem.
At the back.
What lie about South Africa really surprised you that you found out?
Sorry?
What lies surprised you about South Africa that you found out that really blew you away?
I think a lot of the lies did blow me away. The one that really surprised me wasn't so much the lie, but how many people believed it, and that was the story about the prophet who claimed to resurrect somebody from the dead. And it was actually a lot of fun kind of looking at all these miracles that these prophets claimed they could do. And I spent many hours going through YouTube videos of people proudly, or prophets proudly saying that they're walking on air and that they're resurrecting people from the dead. And one person went, phoned God in the middle of a service, and one person went to take a selfie with God. and you could look at the selfie. You just have to make a 5,000 rand donation. But it was astonishing to me how many people seemed to believe that, and I was quite interested in why. So that was a fun chapter to write, but actually there was also a sense of kind of curiosity about.
Jonathan, I do remember that time, and I forget the professor of theology, also sociology at Stellenbosch University, and there was a conversation around prosperity gospel, and I forget the professor, but who said, people are not fools, we are incredibly smart individuals, but how scammers and shysters find us is that they find a particularly vulnerable, or find us in a particularly vulnerable point in our lives. And the message from that interview was, don't judge, because Lester, you could be very educated or reasonably educated person. You now could be considered middle class, but just like everyone else who's middle class, you 3 paychecks away from being homeless. So just think, if in a moment of vulnerability, you are looking for an out, and particularly in this phenomenon of prosperity gospel, that is how people are found. I know incredibly smart people. I know a man who bought 2 cars for a woman he never met because he was lonely. He had no family in and around Cape Town, but he found a woman who said she was living in Switzerland with family in KZN. And could you buy 2 cars and get it delivered to my family in KZN? Because at the moment in time, he was vulnerable and he was lonely.
Yeah, I think there is a sense of desperation, and I think that was my feeling from the people who would give money to these prosperity churches. That I could climb out of my poverty if I just follow the gospel.
Generation. We all had, when I grew up, there was the rand note, and there was a picture of some dude who arrived here in 1652. I still laugh at the mere fact that that wasn't the image of the real Jan van Riebeeck, but it just shows how gullible and easily duped. I mean, people, we're supposed to be intelligent creatures, but for our whole generation, we've all been flippant lied to, and that is not the real person that was adorned. Streets, statues was made in this person's image.
I think the picture is actually that is Johan Vermeiden, who was actually the person depicted as Jan van Riebeeck that I also grew up. I still believe Shaka Zulu is Henrik Tele. And you very quickly write about you having your re-education around Shaka Zulu.
So that was just one example of something that I'd taught at primary school. And what I did is I found a professor at Rhodes who had devoted his life to studying Shaka. And actually quite a serious chapter, I told him about what I'd learned, and he debunked all those myths. And it was quite sobering to know that I'd spent all these years believing my miseducation. And he taught me a very important lesson. He said, don't believe what you're told, check your sources. And I think that's important. Who is telling you this and why? And I think maybe that's also another way to get to the truth, to find out who is telling you and why they're telling you this. And maybe if you can answer that, you will know whether you're being lied to.
Ma'am.
Ask a question. It's not as conceptual and intellectual as all the other questions, but it intrigues me. I want to know your view on whether Gavin Watson is dead.
I do write about Gavin Watson. I definitely think he is dead. I do look at some of those conspiracies, and I suppose there's going to be also lots of conspiracies about Marcus Jooste, which I did write about him as one of our great liars and wondering when he was going to be arrested. And of course, events overtook that. But I do think that, I mean, I can see why people invent theories, and it's quite convenient to have theories, but I think he's dead.
I don't mean to wrap up this conversation on the mere fact that we can talk and be open to to each other, that we are deeply flawed, but in that flawed nature of our being, we find the humor and the little light to get through the next day. But I'm young enough to have only recently being promoted out of youth league status. So I went on a lot of free trips when I was a young journalist, because I then applied, and because you're from South Africa, and they want to accommodate those from the global south. And I had always found our African brothers and sisters always a little bit distant towards me, and I've been on a couple of Africa panels, and I always felt them a little bit distant. And someone says, no, South Africa is the America of Africa. You think you're special. You think you're exceptional. Is that a lie that we tell us? Is that because we were told from basket case to miracle, the greatest constitution on earth? Is it because the Hollywood ending, not for us, we still have to live here and experience load shedding and everything that goes, but there was a Hollywood ending in 1994 that the rest of the world says, well done, congratulations. And that's why maybe we feel we are, maybe particularly African counterparts, you guys think that you're exceptional. Is that a lie?
Yeah, I think it is a lie. I think we're just ordinary, and I think that's actually a good thing. I think it was part of the mythology of the Rainbow Nation that here we are, we're special, and I think it was important for us to believe that, because I think it was important, part of the process of coming to terms with our past, for sworn enemies to extend a hand of friendship, and for this kind of new country to move forward. I think that is why we were told the lie. But I think it's now, and I think that we started to believe it. That was the problem. We were told it, and then we believed it. And so I think we thought that we were special and that we were exceptional, and that perhaps the world owed us something. And I'm not sure the world owes us very much.
Well, Jonathan, it wouldn't be a word of a lie to say that I've enjoyed this last hour. And thank you so much. Best of luck. I hope the 7th book is the one that makes you rich. But thank you so much, and thank you so much. It's a delightful read. It is a read that you could literally not necessarily go from cover to cover, but anyway, and just an incredible yarn. A tale that we've been told about South Africa. Jonathan, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your day.